Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. I'm Guy Gunderson, Supervisory Archivist here at the library. We're very glad to have you here with us for our first program of the fall season. I'm sure you can tell I'm very excited about this. Before we get underway, we have a few housekeeping chores to take care of. Most important of all, let's all turn off our cell phones, smartphones, iPhones, and any other electronic items. And I'll even check mine. I'm good. I hope you are too. As you can tell, we have a camera. We are videotaping our program this evening. So when we get to the question and answer session, we will ask that you go to the microphone in the center aisle at the back of the auditorium to ask your questions. That way we can pick you up on the audio, and our audience can also hear you as well. And please remember, questions only. No public statements. After all, you're not running for public office here. Okay, this thing is on. That's good. Following the program, our speaker will be signing copies of his book, which we also have for sale. And our program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration with financial support from the Ford Presidential Foundation, including its Friends of Ford program, for which we are very grateful. And now on with the show. Professor Bartholomew Sparrow is no stranger to the Ford Library. He received a Ford Presidential Research Travel Grant in 2008 and performed research at the Ford Library for his biography of Brent Scowcroft. In fact, I had the pleasure of working with our speaker as his archivist during his time at the library. Now, in The Strategist, Brent Scowcroft and the Call of National Security, Professor Sparrow has crafted a balanced and long overdue biography of one of our country's most unassuming, unsung, and effective national security advisors and strategists. The Strategist introduces us to Brent Scowcroft, who played a central role in American foreign policy for more than 30 years and has been described as the ideal national security advisor. His service at the highest levels of government began in the early 1970s amid the Cold War and détente, and ended in the early 1980s or 1990s at the dawn of the post-Cold War era. Scowcroft served as national security advisors under Presidents Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush, and as an influential aide or consultant to several other presidents. During his tenure, Scowcroft impacted such major events as the end of American involvement in Vietnam, the historic breakthrough with China, the First Persian Gulf War, and the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. During the Reagan administration, Brent Scowcroft served on the Tower Commission, which investigated the Iran-Contra scandal. And following the September 11th terrorist attacks, General Scowcroft broke ranks with many of his Republican compatriots and criticized the U.S. invasion of Iraq during the George W. Bush administration. Over the course of his career, Brent Scowcroft earned much respect on both sides of the political aisle for his ability to think strategically about American power, his ability to turn ideas into workable policies, and his ability to get those policies implemented. Now, Bartholomew Sparrow is professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, whose football team, by the way, is not faring quite as well as the Wolverines this year. I just thought I'd point that out. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And for the sake of brevity, I will skip over his impressive list of publications, fellowships, and awards. Please join me in welcoming Bartholomew Sparrow back to the Ford Presidential Library.
Thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank the Gerald Ford Library, its supporters, and you, so far anyway, for attending. I'd especially like to thank Director Elaine Didier, Supervisory Archivist Guy Gunderson, Special Events Coordinator Kate Murray, and the others who made this visit possible. I'm also appreciative of the several archivists, including some now retired archivists, who helped me in 2008 and in years since then, especially with the photographs, some of which you'll see this evening. It's good to be back, but I suppose this is not a good reflection on the speed by which I practice my craft. That's 2008. When you go down the tunnel of love in Washington, you hold your own hand. This is one of Brent Scowcroft's favorite jokes he tells when giving a speech. Perhaps you've heard it. Another, a friend in Washington is someone who stabs you in the chest. These may reflect Scowcroft's expectation of how many Americans perceive the nation's capital, but the irony is that Scowcroft has a great many friends and is much admired and even adored in the D.C. area, around the country, and in many foreign cities. He gives Washington a good name, and a study of his life brings attention to those who work for the federal government and serve the United States and the American public, but perhaps do not seek or expect to get public recognition, much less get wealthy from doing so. What I'd like to do this evening is to talk about Brent Scowcroft's quiet but influential role in the history of national security policy, say something about why he was so unusually effective, and then highlight some of his particular contributions in the Ford White House. I'll wrap up by discussing why he may be considered one of the United States' foremost strategists. A little background, and I'll return to Scowcroft's background later. The fact that Scowcroft ended up in the White House and became Deputy National Security Advisor under Henry Kissinger, and eventually National Security Advisor outright, was by design. His Air Force bosses were hoping Scowcroft would attract Kissinger's attention and be chosen as his next deputy. He did, and he was. So after a year as military assistant, Scowcroft became Kissinger's deputy in early 1973 at the beginning of Richard Nixon's second term in office. And in November 1975, 15 months after Ford became president, Scowcroft was appointed National Security Advisor. Scowcroft would become one of President Nixon's most trusted advisors. He was Gerald Ford's right-hand man and good friend, as we know, and he was George H.W. Bush's confidential advisor and valued longtime companion. But he was also an important advisor to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, and a mentor and friend and advisor to National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and Defense Secretary Robert Gates during Bush 43's second term. He also advised the Obama administration, the scale of which is not yet clear, at least to me. But almost all of this advising was behind the scenes. During the last phase of the Vietnam War, for example, Scowcroft oversaw the evacuation of Saigon in South Vietnam. He was at the nexus of President Ford and his political advisors, Secretary of State Kissinger, Ambassador Graham Martin, and the State Department, the Pentagon and Joint Chiefs, Congress, and the press. He and the President, unlike others, wanted to delay the evacuation as long as possible so as to get as many South Vietnamese out as possible. 130,000 Vietnamese left South Vietnam in April 1975, 10 times the number expected by the State Department. And in just the final 14 hours, Marine Corps helicopters lifted out almost 8,000 U.S. personnel, embassy officials, South Vietnamese, and dependents. He was there at the opening to China in the first few years thereafter. As an aside, one of the first times when he fell asleep, because he was famous for catching cat naps, and he learned this between classes at West Point. One of the first times I have public documentation of this doing it in an official role was in a visit to Mao Zedong in Peking in 1974. Anyway, he and others in the Ford administration had to persevere in the face of the difficulties of Congress, the presidency in crisis, and the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Later, he succeeded in keeping U.S.-China relations intact in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, fearing a Moscow-Beijing rapprochement, perhaps a new bamboo curtain, or a return to the Cultural Revolution, as well as anticipating the upside in U.S. commercial opportunities. During the Reagan administration, Scowcroft, as chair of the President's Commission on Strategic Forces, brilliantly managed to overcome the impasse over how the new MX missile was to be stationed after 2 unsuccessful previous tries. Then, as one of 3 members of the Tower Board, he investigated the functioning and role of the National Security Council after the Iran-Contra affair and managed to limit the damage. Without a smoking gun, and despite the efforts of the joint House and Senate committees and the efforts of the special prosecutor, Iran-Contra has remained, for better or worse, no more than a long, unsavory footnote to the Reagan legacy. Then, in the first Bush administration, Scowcroft, together with the President and Secretary of State James A. Baker, succeeded in overseeing the democratic reform and liberalization of Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany. Crucial here was the juggling and fitting together of military issues, economic measures, and diplomacy to overcome the hostility of 3 of the 4 official occupying powers. That is to say, the Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom all were opposed to reunified Germany within the North Atlantic Alliance. Crucially, though, the Bush administration avoided dancing on the wall, which may have actually provoked a backlash by the Soviet hardliners in the party, military, and industry. One of Scowcroft's chief legacies was his insistence that the administration get Iraqi forces to withdraw from Kuwait, by coercion if need be. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, Secretary of State Baker, and others in the administration, even President Bush, were initially uncertain or on the fence about how to proceed after the invasion. And it was Scowcroft who was chiefly responsible for quickly getting the president on board. And this was in a conversation they held after the first NSC meeting, which arrived at no conclusions. Thereafter, and this is typical of Scowcroft, he credited George Bush for the administration's resolve. Oh, sorry, what happened here? Let's see. There we go. He then helped build the 28-country coalition and get Congress to grant executive authority and pass 12 UN resolutions in support of the eviction of Iraq from Kuwait. Most importantly, Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft were on watch at the end of the Cold War. They were able to coax and cajole the Soviet Union into its dissolution and ultimately its implosion. They pushed the Soviet Union as hard as they could, while also allowing Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders economic incentives and allowed them to save face and never really feel directly threatened by the United States or by NATO. Scowcroft himself initiated the reduction of nuclear warheads to 1 per ICBM, and he helped secure the cooperation of other governments and proposed that the conventional forces be greatly reduced in Central Europe, something that the Pentagon actually was opposed to doing. We forget, by the way, that for all of Gorbachev's inspiring rhetoric and for all of the renewed détente in the last 2 years of the Reagan administration, that the Soviet conventional and nuclear weapons were all still very much in place. There in Central Europe and in their silos. The Soviet Union was still aiding Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia, and the Afghanistan regime. Neither had Gorbachev or the Politburo renounced the Union of the Workers of the World and the overthrow of capitalism. In other areas, Scowcroft was less successful. In Afghanistan, after Soviet troops withdrew in February 1989, some new work is colonial America, so that's why I'm shifting centuries. The Bush administration didn't have the bandwidth or prescience, if you will, to devote more attention and effort. The same with Yugoslavia under Milosevic, where there was a bit of wishful thinking that Yugoslavia wouldn't fail, as well as an element of fatigue after Tiananmen Square, after the reunification of Germany in the Gulf War. Although Baker and others contended that the United States didn't have a dog in the fight, it did, of course. The United States had an interest in seeing that Europe could provide for some minimal security issues, that it could defray some of its cost of its European forces, and that Europe not be divided, or at least the NATO members not be divided on Yugoslavia, which they were, because they all viewed Yugoslavia differently. And Yugoslavia marked the failure of an obvious multicultural society, and and so its loss was really a defeat for toleration and for pluralism. And what of the United States' own position as the leader of the world, and then standing by in the face of the horrors of Bosnia and elsewhere in the former Yugoslavia? Out of office, and more recently in his role as senior statesman, he opposed going to war against Iraq after September 11, 2001, as you heard. And in a Wall Street Journal op-ed in August 2002, Scowcroft argued that the invasion and occupation of Iraq would be very expensive and have very serious and bloody consequences. He argued that Saddam Hussein was first and foremost a power-hungry survivor who had little cause to join with al-Qaeda, and that he could be deterred just like other aggressors. He warned, too, that should the United States attack Iraq, the ensuing war would swell the ranks of terrorists, sidetrack U.S. policy from grappling from the more important Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and possibly destabilize Arab regimes in the region. The irony being that one of Saddam's strategic objectives was precisely such destabilization. Yet, and this is what I think what makes him remarkable, in 2007 he came out in support of the surge, even though he was ostracized earlier by this public dissent. And since 1994, he has run his own international business consulting firm, probably the most highly regarded in Washington among such firms, according to people I've talked to who are close observers. Just a few weeks ago, he came out in support of the Iran agreement in a syndicated op-ed. And of course, the agreement wasn't blocked. So what made him so effective? This is the elder statesman. I didn't change my slide on time. So what made him so effective? One was that he came from a very well-established family. He was very secure. He had no status anxiety. He was raised in a loving household and security in this Ogden Mormon community. He was close to both his parents. His father managed the family business, which I'll turn to shortly, and he had a happy and active childhood with lots of friends as the youngest of 3 children and only boy. He was a Boy Scout. He was shy but well-liked, admired by his peers, had perfect attendance in the Polk Elementary School Drum Corps, which you see here he is there. And he was then commandant of the Ogden High School ROTC. Richard Ballantyne, one of his great-grandfathers, was a captain of a Mormon company who led Mormons from Omaha through the Intermountain West to Salt Lake City, was a missionary in India, and the founder of Mormon Sunday schools. Another great-grandfather, John Scowcroft, here, founded a very successful company of dry goods and food wholesale merchants, the largest between Omaha and San Francisco. Scowcroft and Sons was helped by the fact that Ogden was a hub for rail traffic throughout the West. The Transcontinental Railroad switched from the Union Pacific to the Central Pacific, or vice versa, close to where the Golden Spike originated. It was originally driven in. So that's connected the roads going west and east. So we met at the Golden Spike, which was not far from where Ogden is. In fact, you had to get off at Ogden to switch trains, and a total of 7 different railroads joined up together in Ogden. And so this, with a wholesale dry goods business, the fact that it was at the center of this hub, as a hub and spoke system with railroads instead of airlines, this of course made it very, very effective and very efficient. But with all this coming and going, the town leaders boasted, well, you can't go anywhere without coming to Ogden. But the flip side of this is that Ogden was much more secular than the rest of Utah and had a thriving crime scene with plenty of saloons, opium dens, brothels, and gambling establishments. Al Capone is reported to have said Ogden was too rough a town for him. After reading West Point today at the age of 12, Scowcroft was determined to going to the U.S. Military Academy. He did well at West Point, which included managing the undefeated football teams of the mid-late 40s, and joined the Army Air Corps after a war-shortened 3-year curriculum. And this is him here, right sitting on the ground. But 2.5 years later, while training in Manchester, New Hampshire, his F-51 Mustang crashed and Scowcroft almost died, or he could have easily been paralyzed for life. He broke his back and would spend almost 2 years in military hospitals. No longer allowed to fly, he had to remake his career. He decided to become an expert in national security, and he studied European, Russian, and world history, nuclear weapons and deterrence theory, conventional warfare, and government and law. Graduate school in international relations at Columbia, eventually earning a doctorate, at the Armed Forces Staff College and at the National War College, as well as teaching for 4 years at West Point and 2 years at the U.S. Air Force Academy, allowed him to do just that. This commitment to mastering and ultimately contributing to U.S. national security was an important factor as well behind Scowcroft's effectiveness. His superior officers repeatedly noted his ability to keep growing as an officer. He also impressed his superiors with his initiative, his willingness to go the extra mile, and his ability to be a team player, even if decisions didn't go his way. Notably, they did not see him as having an upper ceiling. And Scowcroft would have surely earned a 4th star, just as had Alexander Haig and as would Colin Powell, had he not retired from the military when he became National Security Advisor on November 2nd, 1975. Besides his poise and the seriousness of his military ambition and his expertise, another part of his effectiveness was his sense of humor, his emotional intelligence. Although the term emotional intelligence wasn't really coined until the 80s and didn't become in use until the 90s. He laughs easily, enjoys practical jokes, or at least did in earlier days, and is respectful of others. He listens and does not feel the need to impress them. Indicatively, he got along well with Kissinger in the 70s, one of the few who worked alongside Kissinger as an equal. And even though Scowcroft and Dick Cheney fell out in 2001 and have remained estranged, they were best friends during the Ford administration. Bill Gulley, a friend of Scowcroft's who succeeded him as military assistant to the president, called Cheney and Scowcroft the 2 most loved men in the Ford White House. Yet despite Scowcroft's cordial manner and affability, he was no pushover. But they had fun together. Richard Haas, who is now president of the Council of Foreign Relations, reported that the Bush administration was the most collegial of any of the 4 in which he served. Working there was actually fun, he said. It sounds bizarre, but it was by far the most enjoyable experience a lot of us have had or had before or since in government. There was a lot of camaraderie and kidding around. It was very relaxed. What also made Scowcroft extremely effective was his multivocality, his ability to speak to different audiences credibly, to link policy subsystems, and connect to different knowledge communities. He was expert and experienced with respect to international relations, as we've seen, with nuclear strategy and deterrence, with intelligence, where he served in Belgrade as an Air Force intelligence officer and then later on played another role, which I'll come to later, and of course in economics and international commerce. This made him an excellent coordinator and an excellent advisor and a great crisis manager. So what about the Ford administration? President Ford had gotten to know Scowcroft through a series of weekly one-on-one briefings that he gave the vice president for between 1 and 2 hours in the afternoons, and these started in October 1973 at Nixon's request, following Agnew's resignation, and covered a range of complex topics in international politics and national security. Since Gerald Ford had focused mostly on budgetary matters and domestic issues as a member of Congress, the purpose of the tutorials when Scowcroft took over from Kissinger, which was in November, through August 74, was to educate Ford on national security issues. Scowcroft conducted the tutorials with phenomenal intensity, according to White House witnesses. But rather than merely lecture Ford, he had the NSC staff, with the help of the CIA, draft short papers on major issues such as arms control, U.S.-Japan policy, human rights, And then each week, Ford was assigned one of these papers to read and digest in advance of their meetings. Scowcroft would then brief the vice president on what had happened around the world that week, and then lead a discussion on that week's topic. Ford thereby became familiar with the context and development of national security policy, learned the ins and outs of current events, and acquired a working knowledge of the personalities and idiosyncrasies of the principal actors in foreign affairs. This informal tutoring forged a close bond between the two men, one that was reinforced when Ford took office, since Scowcroft now went in to see him 3 or 4 times a day, handing him memos on pressing issues, and when solicited, offered his advice. In a difficult time, Scowcroft, in the words of one national security expert, was a rock of stability. Their relationship was much closer than that of the Nixon-Scowcroft relationship. Whereas it was hard for anyone, even Pat Nixon, to get close to Richard Nixon, Ford was less complicated. He didn't seek the White House and would have probably been content to stay on as House Minority Leader, perhaps eventually becoming House Speaker, before retiring and taking up another occupation. Ford did not even plan to stand for election in 1976 and only changed his mind so he wouldn't be a lame duck president for 2.5 years. Ford was the opposite of the imperial president in the manner of LBJ and Nixon. He was modest, down to earth, and plain-spoken, as well as convivial, relaxed, and comfortable with himself, just like Scowcroft. Like Scowcroft, too, he was secure enough not to let Kissinger's huge personality get to him. Both Ford and Scowcroft grew up in mid-America, were moderate to conservative Republicans, and were deeply patriotic. Ford came to greatly respect Scowcroft's first-rate intellect, his independent thinking, and utter reliability, and Scowcroft, in turn, became very fond of the president. After the White House, the two stayed close, and Scowcroft called Gerald Ford a very warm, good-hearted human being, a very dear friend. Notwithstanding their friendship, the Ford presidency was a difficult period, as we know, and with the White House under siege, with Vietnam Watergate, and then the pardon. And Scowcroft, in fact, spoke of them having a bunker mentality. But of course, they persevered. But one of the administration's few obvious triumphs was the handling of the seized U.S.-based container ship, the Mayaguez, and that of its crew, just 2 weeks after the evacuation of Saigon. Scowcroft was crisis manager and essentially guided the 3 parts of the administration's response. That is, he wasn't the military man, he wasn't administering them, but he was kind of quality control. He was overseeing them and making sure that everything was figuring out and make sure there weren't any gaps. So what were the 3 parts? One was a ground assault on the island of Koh Tang. Another was an air attack on the Cambodian mainland. And the third was the physical recapture of the Mayaguez. And some of the things that Scowcroft did were to brief members of the NSC on where things stood during the critical Tuesday midnight NSC meeting. He kept several meetings, the several NSC meetings are 5 in all, focused on what needed to be decided and made sure that crucial information surfaced. For example, Scowcroft and Rumsfeld made the important point that the aircraft from the Coral Sea aircraft carrier could arrive at the battle scene significantly in advance of the carrier itself, which seems pretty obvious, but it's something that Defense Secretary Schlesinger and Air Force General Jones, then acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs, neglected to point out. Scowcroft also reminded everyone of the diplomatic consequences of damaging the U.S.-Thai relationship by using Thai bases in connection with U.S. military operations and the Mayaguez seizure. Several weeks after the Mayaguez, the crisis, the Department of Defense placed 2 letters in Lieutenant General Scowcroft's personnel file. The first was from Kissinger. "Dear Brent," he wrote, "your extraordinary performance during the Mayaguez was no surprise to me, but it reminded me of the debt I and the President and the country owe you. You were the focal point of the effort. Your judgment and strengths were a tremendous support. The successful outcome was your contribution as much as anyone's." The other letter was signed Jerry Ford. The President wrote, "During the Mayaguez incident, your support to me was even more than your usual superb contribution. 24 hours a day, you're a pillar of strength. Your dedication and professional skill were in the highest traditions of service of the armed forces of the United States. I want you to know how much I appreciate it. Not only the crew of the Mayaguez and their families, but all Americans owe you a debt of gratitude." The Maiguez incident marked the last official battle of the Vietnam War, and the names of the 3 Marines left behind on the island of Koh Tang were the last names engraved on Maya Lin's Vietnam War memorial. The United States had entered into China to save a country, Kissinger noted ironically, and ended by rescuing a ship. Intelligence was another issue area where Scowcroft played a vital role. After Seymour Hersh broke the story of the CIA's family jewels, the Senate created the Select Committee to study government operation with respect to intelligence activities, known as the Church Committee. And just a few weeks later, the House created a similar committee under New York Congressman Otis Pike. Among the family jewels were records that the CIA wiretapped almost 10,000 American citizens, kept files on 100,000 Americans, opened Americans' first-class mail, infiltrated domestic anti-war and black activist groups, and conducted psychological experiments on civilians, all legally prohibited. Among the CIA's other improper surveillance activities were illegal breaking and entering of the premises of 2 former CIA employees, the placement of wiretaps on 2 newspaper columnists, and the physical surveillance of 3 former CIA employees and 5 news reporters. The CIA also had recruited paid informants among Washington area dissident groups and employed persons to infiltrate U.S. dissident groups for the purpose of collecting foreign intelligence. So as National Security Advisor, Scowcroft was caught up in this, and in 3 aspects in particular. One was making decisions on how to respond to congressional requests, whether to release classified information, redact classified documents before handing them over, or provide paraphrased versions of those same documents. He wanted to manage the release of information that could hurt the CIA, downgrade the effectiveness of the intelligence community, and handicap national security policy. But to Scowcroft's dismay, the information was being leaked, chiefly by CIA Director William Colby. Handling Colby, then, was the second aspect of the CIA scandal that involved Scowcroft. Colby had had an outstanding record in World War II, in post-war Italy, and then in Vietnam with a controversial Phoenix program, which arrested, interrogated, and tortured, and eventually killed thousands of suspected Viet Cong. But after the disclosure of the family jewels and with the investigations by the Church and Pike committees, Colby decided to come clean. Over a 12-month period, he made 32 trips to Capitol Hill to testify, revealing many of the CIA's activities, and he said that he intended to hand the CIA additional documents, hand over additional documents to Senator Church, even though President Ford, Kissinger, Scowcroft, and the President's General Counsel hadn't yet agreed as to whether they should admit the documents. Scowcroft, who in his position had worked closely on intelligence issues, of course, and who had gotten to know Colby quite well, did not understand how Colby could side with Congress rather than the executive branch. Bill really became a tortured soul in this period, Scowcroft said. He saw his life and his life work crumbling. Or, as Kissinger joked to Colby, who was a devout Catholic, Bill, you know what you do when you go up to the Hill? You go to confession. The intelligence scandal prompted Scowcroft to reform how the White House handled intelligence. And this is the third aspect of his engagement with the intelligence investigations. Following the Rockefeller Commission report, which was where they set up the commission to investigate the family jewels and wanted to really get ahead of Congress and get ahead of the press on and the public on this issue. Following this was for public consumption, Scowcroft ordered a comprehensive study of the organization and management of the entire intelligence community. And then in January '76, he met with the president and other advisors for a 2-hour meeting, where he discussed a number of key issues. He discussed the foreign intelligence community sharing information with the FBI, whether the president should have an independent intelligence advisor, and considered how covert action proposals should be handled. He also made recommendations as to how the leadership of the intelligence community could be improved, how intelligence could be consolidated, and how analysis and production should be realigned. He also discussed whether covert action should be separated from the CIA and speculated about a major reorganization for the community. A month later, the president laid out the new ground rules for intelligence. The control of the intelligence would be retained in the National Security Council following the original 1947 National Security Act, only now the National Security Advisor would be responsible. He, or later she, would initiate intelligence planning, conduct semi-annual policy reviews of foreign intelligence activities, and manage the foreign intelligence community. Covert actions were to be reviewed and recommended by a new Special Operations Advisory Group, and general oversight of the CIA was to be conducted by a new Intelligence Oversight Board, a 3-person subgroup of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Newsweek magazine determined that the biggest winner of the reorganization of these new rules was George Bush, the newly appointed DCI, since the director of the Central Intelligence now oversaw the intelligence budgets together with the Assistant Secretary of Defense and the Deputy National Security Advisor. And Scowcroft, as National Security Advisor, would now chair the Special Intelligence Operation Advisory Group. A third issue I'll discuss is Scowcroft's role in the rescue of the British pound sterling. It's no exaggeration to characterize Britain of the mid-70s as the battlefield of class warfare being waged between the trade unions, which were seeking higher wages, and business, which wanted to resist concessions at a time when the British industrial economy was struggling. In response to the big budget deficits and large trade deficits Britain had run in 74 and 75 under the Wilson and Callaghan governments, the British Treasury and Bank of England made the decision to use a secret policy of a controlled devaluation of the pound, which meant periodic limited sales of the pound in international markets, along with more public measures such as restricting wage increases and cutting government spending to bring down inflation. Britain succeeded at bringing inflation down from 25% annual rate in mid-75 to 11.5% just 1 year later. But a further run on the pound in the last quarter of 76 increased the pressure on Callaghan to act. So the Prime Minister began to talk with other heads of government about putting together an IMF loan in the event that the falling pound reduced British financial reserves to unstable levels. When news of the proposed rescue was leaked, the pound plummeted through the $2 level. With a run on the sterling and with untenable budget deficits, Callaghan now had no choice but to approach the United States because the United States was, of course, the leading stakeholder in the IMF. Although Ford was strongly committed to helping Callaghan, his biggest buddy among foreign leaders, he called him, many U.S. officials, economists, and financial experts were highly critical of British policies and wanted to first see the Labour government make even larger spending cuts and impose greater restrictions on wage increases before considering a multi-billion-dollar loan. So any solution to this impasse had to once be economically plausible and politically viable, since a collapse of the Labour government would only trigger a further crisis in confidence, and then for more of a run on the pound. Also, the United States had to coordinate any funding program with other principal IMF member states, and if the United States and IMF pushed too hard, the Callaghan government might be in trouble, and there could be a very severe negative reaction. But if Britain didn't respond to its plummeting currency and domestic situation, it could face an even larger crisis. So the United States and Britain therefore had to engage in delicate international negotiations and discussions with other leading IMF countries. Here's where Scowcroft comes in. Since Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon were at odds with each other and basically couldn't talk to each other. Scowcroft wasn't a banker, an economist, or international financial expert, but he was more than competent in economics and understood the ramifications of the falling pound. More importantly, he was able to collaborate with Treasury officials, other members of the Ford administration, and the finance ministers and other foreign representatives. For Scowcroft, the United States and Britain's fate were irrevocably linked, and the United States needed to place its full faith and credit behind the British people. Scowcroft was very concerned about the larger geostrategic implications of a destabilized, crisis-stricken Britain, and he was worried that the whole situation could come apart in a serious way. It was, Scowcroft said, considered by us to be the greatest single threat to the Western world, and it took immense amount of his time in the fall of '76. Throughout this process, Scowcroft proceeded quickly and quietly, within a week, and this is in mid-November 76, he was able to secure a favorable IMF vote for a $4 billion loan to the Callahan government, which is actually more than $16 billion in 2012 dollars, and to get the Callahan government to agree to further fiscal restrictions as a condition, including public spending cuts, transferring funds to investment, and accepting higher levels of unemployment. The British had to draft a 7-page letter of intent to be included as part of an IMF loan, the first such time a document had been required of an advanced industrial nation. This humiliating letter, as one observer called it, expressed the Labor government's intent to pursue stable economic policies, such as on spending, less on roads, ending wage increases, raising taxes, and so forth, all bitter pills for Callahan's Labor government. Sweetening the deal for Britain, though, was a separate agreement by the United States to extend a $4 billion line of credit to shore up the pound for the few years until North Sea oil began producing significant revenues, which started in 1980. With the British and U.S. government on board with this complicated compromise, Scowcroft was able to get other key IMF members, Germany in particular, to agree to the proposed solution. As a result, the pound stabilized and slowly regained some of its lost ground, and the crisis abated. All this without the press learning a thing, which was a testimony about how much everyone trusted Scowcroft was willing to proceed quietly, because of course if the press leaked it, or was leaked to the press, then there'd be repercussions on the pound. When the pound collapsed in the summer of '76 and Callahan was forced to return to the IMF for help, grimly swallowing £3 billion in spending cuts in the next few years, he showed guts and leadership, the historian Dominic Sandbrook writes. It was one of the great unsung turning points of modern British history, the point at which the people at the top realized that only the strongest medicine could cure the nation's ills. For the British to have to go hand in hand to the United States and the IMF for a loan to shore up the pound sterling was a huge loss in prestige for a country that had long been the world's foremost financial power, a position it had held for 100 years. The collapse of the pound and the IMF crisis of '76 was a turning point in another sense too, Sandbrook observes. It was the moment when the parochial, introspective assumptions of British politics were shattered for good. Britain was now inextricably locked in a vast global system. But it was, as many have remarked, a close-run thing, and it was Scowcroft who made it happen. But as we know, the public victories like the Maiguez, or the quiet victories like the rescue of the pound, or the quiet reorganization of intelligence, couldn't get Ford elected president in his own right. In many ways, though, Scowcroft's difficulties with Congress and the press during this troubled presidency forced him to grow as a policymaker. In fact, I would argue that the short Ford administration made possible the able use of the NSC system, the working relationships with members of Congress and the press, and the establishment of rapport with foreign heads of state that then facilitated the reunification of Germany within NATO, the successful lead-up and conduct of the 1991 Gulf War, and the amazing end of the Cold War with almost no casualties. So why the strategist in the title? As an aside, when we first came up with a title, there were very few books entitled The Strategist. Since then, at least 3 books came out with the very same title. One is a police procedural, another a financial thriller, and a third a self-help book on how to be the leader your business needs. So much for planning. So anyway, so why a strategist, and why is he so integral to the Ford administration? In fact, the title is counterintuitive for many, since they regard Scowcroft as one of the many faceless advisors to 2 moderate one-term presidents, Gerald Ford and the elder George Bush. Or they see him as an operator or fixer at the most. And to be sure, Scowcroft is not a strategist in the sense of a Sun Tzu or a Karl von Clausewitz. Indeed, several former officials I talked to didn't regard him as a strategist, with one describing him as working between the 40-yard lines. But several others who worked with him, including foreign leaders such as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, did think of him as a strategist. And I think the thing is he kept a side of himself hidden from public view, just as the crediting Bush for having the backbone to resist the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq. So he deflected any credit, and he was kept this out of public view. So this is why I think few have, in the past at least, associated him as being a strategist. So he's more known in Washington, but around the country much less so. But he has given small doses of his strategy in 100 or so op-eds he has written over the last 4 decades, almost all of them during the Reagan, Clinton, and George W. Bush administration when he was out of office. And incidentally, this is only a handful of op-eds behind the number written by Kissinger and Brzezinski over the same period, who were the largest writers of op-eds that I could count. The strategic sense is also evident in A World Transformed and in America and the World with Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Ignatius. So what is strategy? Well, strategy is having a goal and then being able to see the pieces in play that can then realize this goal. And because of Scowcroft's knowledge of history and knowledge of countries and the different capabilities economically, materially, diplomatically of these countries, he was able to see strategy as sort of say a chessboard and decide, okay, these are my objectives, here are the different variables or actors with which I'm working, and here's how we proceed to this end. So, for example, he thought the idea that Reagan should say to Gorbachev or to the world, tear down this wall, was preposterous, because as you know from elementary psychology, if you tell someone, you command someone to do something, and it's a rival of yours, or it could be a belligerent dog or a child, the last thing they're going to do is to tear down that wall. In fact, that was a good way to provoke a backlash. So, but what he did, he says, well, how do I make the wall irrelevant? And he did this by this coaxing and cajoling that allowed the Soviet Union to have the carrots and sticks to slowly release Germany and slowly let go of the Soviet Empire and the Eastern European satellites. And so I think it's this sense of and what he did in the Ford administration was sort of less on a grand scale than, of course, during the Bush administration, but as I suggested, that was kind of a buildup. So that's kind of the sense of a strategist, as being able to see the large picture. And this also obtained with SALT I and SALT II, the opening to China, NAFTA, trade, all sorts of issues where he sort of saw the end goal and then worked bureaucratically and internationally to make sure those things happened. But to be clear, a crucial aspect of the strategist is operational. One can be a superb strategist, whether a campaign consultant, a military genius, or a conceptually minded historian, but if that person is advising from the sidelines and not being listened to, it's hard to consider him or her as a strategist. Consider George Kennan, known for his long telegram from Moscow, and then writing as Mr. X on the sources of Soviet conduct in foreign affairs. Yet after these two closely spaced pieces, he wasn't near power at all, and it was basically ignored for decades thereafter when writing in Princeton and on his Pennsylvania farm. This is not to take anything away from Kennan, but it is to point out that to be a strategist, you could be a wonderful armchair theorist, but you're not able to affect these, then you have to wonder how much of a strategist you are. And so unlike many noteworthy insiders, he has been remarkably influential over multiple presidential terms from the early 70s forward to now to the 2010s, and over the course of his life from his late 40s and early 50s until now, the age of 90s. And so I think it's this reasons of this, his longevity, his ability to see the end game as in knowing, okay, I'm going to reduce these conventional forces in Europe, or change the profile of the U.S. strategic forces, get the Soviet Union, decide the carrots and sticks, this ability to see the big picture, being able to then see those come to fruition because of his knowledge of the interagency process, and then the fact that he's able to do this over decades, I think really makes him a remarkable, probably the foremost strategist that the United States has had, certainly in recent history. No other policymaker has been as influential for so long, a testament, I think, to his expertise and judgment, the respect others had for him, and the trust he has earned. Thank you. So if you have questions, please use the microphone and maybe say your name and affiliation. Or
My name is Claire Dahl, and I'm a retired history teacher from Pioneer High School here in Ann Arbor. My question would be, possibly for today, would you say that he'd noticed that the Middle East and the mess we're in is one of these chessboards that he could maneuver and play with, and look at the bigger picture? Or are we in a time period of no rules and no way to really evaluate or foresee what's going to happen? Is it something that he could look at that big picture and say, I see where we're headed, and this is how we do it?
Yeah, I'm not enough of a contemporary Middle East expert to answer that. I follow the news perhaps as much or maybe less than some of you. I think he certainly would have a sense of the histories and the players. I mean, sort of ISIS. I mean, one of the things that I think he was superb at doing was using force in a very limited way. I mean, when he was working with Nixon, one of the things where he was absolutely outstanding was the work he did on behalf of the MIAs and POWs. So he has this empathy for the other Americans, other people. He's a very kindly and respectful man, as those of you who know him can attest to. So I think what he would do in this situation is, if he is protective of Americans' blood and treasure, he'd say, well, if we were happy with just deterring Saddam Hussein, well, and this is just me winging it, by the way, so I'm not going to put any words in his mouth, I would think he'd be kind of cautious about, well, what happens if ISIS had to rule for a while? How successful would they be? I mean, what would happen if we could find ways to sort of get the other Middle Eastern states to help out with refugees in Syria and to contribute to the efforts? And so I think he'd be much better than really most recent presidents have been at getting other allies, other NATO members, other even Arab states to work together and say, look, this is an issue. We all have an interest in stability. Let's see how we can map this out, and let's try to do this in a way that is we don't put the United States at possible conflict with Russia and proceed. But that's kind of off the cuff answer, and I don't pretend to know, but I think it's certainly hard to imagine that that there aren't better ways than we're pursuing now.
Hi, thank you for talking today. My name's Jim Osborne. I'm an engineer and I live in Ann Arbor. What intrigued me was this. His background was as a military man, and most of what he did reflected on that. Yet what surprised me was the currency support for Great Britain in the 1970s. What was his background that enabled him to be effective in that?
Well, I think one was this multivocality that he was, because one of the people who have written about this crisis said that Harold Lever, who was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, this is kind of their writing, said they would bring Scowcroft to tears about the stories of the decline of the UK and how Europe was going to collapse and the end of NATO and so forth. And they're exaggerating, but I think he was aware of the strategic consequence. He was aware, had enough business background and commercial experience to know about the economic stakes. And he also knew the importance of sort of NATO and having Britain Britain was a big supporter of nuclear forces in Europe, a big supporter of course, having a strong NATO military. And so between that and then his ability to deal with, in this case not the press, but his ability to deal with other members, for example, in the Treasury Department and the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Greenspan and others. So it's his ability to kind of listen and the fact that people trusted him as an honest broker and a go-between, and then the fact that he was expert in these areas, I mean, if not a top economic guy, but expert enough. And then he had people working for him, like Robert Hormats of Goldman Sachs and others, so he could draw on top talent and bring it together. And people trusted him to proceed because they didn't. I mean, there's a lot of suspicion for all of Kissinger's virtues that he provoked animosity as well, and he wasn't a good team player in the way that Scowcroft was.
So in a nutshell, he recognized the threat and then drew on resources to help solve it.
Yeah, I think it's the ability to work with other people in a way, and people who have strong egos and strong positions, like the guy who was the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs was a Pittsburgh banker by the name of Edwin Yeo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But he had very strong positions and was proud of kind of a staunch conservative with respect to, kind of hardline, along with Simon about hardline, about, well, look, cut budgets and austerity and no wage increases and basically, get the unions, get the trade unions council. And he kind of was, Scowcroft was able to work with them, but also cajole him and get him to also cede something and say, look, we have to make this work. So that took a set of interpersonal skills as well as this different knowledge bases.
Thank you.
Yep.
My name is Lon Cook. I live here in Ann Arbor. Can you, prior to the downfall or the end of the Cold War, can you expand on the relationship between Brent Scowcroft, Admiral Crowe, and Marshal Akrameyev?
Yeah, that's. I know that he'd worked with Akrameyev, and they were there together off Malta when the Malta summit in December '89. He'd met him on other occasions, I think, during the Ford administration. I don't know the particulars of that. And Admiral Crowe, I think he was on. I think they're on good terms, but not great terms. I mean, those are. Crowe wasn't. Crowe was. They inherited Crowe, then Powell comes in as chairman of the Joint Chiefs later on. That doesn't happen right away, and perhaps you know more than I do about this. But I'm not. I mean, I have some stuff about, but I'm not privy to their exact relationships. No. Thanks.
I came in a little late, so forgive me if you touched on this, but I was wondering on General Scowcroft's position on the Iraq invasion, and I believe he was negative on that. What was the impact in terms of relations with George W. Bush, and in terms of his taking that position and where he stood, and then all the others who supported it?
Yeah, no, he was. George W. Bush reads the paper. He's in Texas, in Crawford, his ranch, and he reads the paper and he goes ballistic. And he calls Connie Rice in Washington and says, "What is this guy doing?" Because he thought, here he is, this a longtime Republican supporter and advisor of my father's. He was actually served as the chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board during the term. So he was actually a office holder for the administration. He was holding this, I guess, as a non-paid position, but nonetheless, he had been appointed to this position. He was running this intelligence called it was intelligence board to kind of to review the reform of the intelligence community, and 9/11 happens in the middle of it. But anyway, so he's close to the administration. He writes this op-ed, and Bush is furious. Condi Rice, Scowcroft describes it as took him to the woodshed, even though she was his protege and he was her mentor, and he kind of plucked her out of Stanford and got her to work for got into the Aspen Strategy Group and got her to meet folks in industry, and then brings her into Washington under the NSC staff. Under Bush 41. So when this happens, he's a kind of a persona non grata for the administration for a few years, really until the second term in office, because by then they realized that, okay, this was a mistake, and they never did find the WMDs, and the invasions handled very poorly, and all these missteps and so forth. So yeah, they had a really falling out. I mean, at one point, George W. Bush calls them, talks about these troublesome old men of his father's administration, and it's really a very difficult period. And but the thing that's interesting is that this op-ed, He'd already been on television. There'd been a lot of news stories about his position. Everybody knew where he stood, but they just weren't listening or having really there wasn't kind of an honest broker or discussion about it. And there was kind of, and I'm sure you well remember, there was a time people a lot of scared and wanted action and wanted things done, and there was kind of this juggernaut for action against Iraq, even if it wasn't called for.
Presentation. So with that, thank you for the terrific program. We have this tradition that we have a small gift of appreciation, a token of our appreciation for our speakers. So we have a pen set with Gerald Ford's signature engraved on that for you, which you can use to actually sign copies of your book afterwards. So thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And before we adjourn, I have just a couple of announcements and a special invitation for all of you. Many of you are very familiar with our auditorium and our public spaces. Well, I would like to invite you to visit our archive, where you can learn more about Brent Scowcroft, foreign policy, and other issues from the Ford administration. It's a wonderful opportunity to read our primary source materials about government at the highest levels. I guarantee you'll find it both interesting and fun, and you'll kind of, after this experience, you'll understand why former and current staff over the years have many times said, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. So there's no appointment necessary, just drop by, and it's a great way to while away some free time. Upcoming programs, our next program is October 27th. Tom Davis and Martin Frost, authors of The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis. And November 12th, Betty Caroli, author of Lady Bird and Lyndon, The Hidden Story of a Marriage That Made a President. Flyers for these programs are available outside the auditorium. And last, if you have not already signed up for our email list for program announcements or Friends of Ford, forms are available for that as well. Now I invite you to meet our speaker, get your books signed, and enjoy the reception. Thank you all for coming.